Cheers, Mr. Chairman.
Governor Perez, let's go straight into finance.
Perfect. At this point, we will convene our Budget and Finance Committee. Minoka, would you please call the roll?
Okay. Governor Perez, I know you are here. Governor Coombs?
Here.
Governor Beard?
Here.
Chair Colson?
Here.
Governor Parker?
Here.
Governor Rude? Governor Temple?
Here.
Governor Tripp?
Here.
Governor Webster? Here. Governor Watley?
Here.
Chair Perez, you have a quorum.
Thank you, Minoka. Good morning, everyone. I'm sure you recall our discussion in June about differential tuition increases. After that process, Chair Colson had reached out to myself and to Governor Kuntz and has asked us to work together with Tim and the staff to try to determine some form of a performance-based model that might help guide our board in future differential tuition discussions. We've started the process. Tim has been working well independently with Governor Kuntz and I to identify a small set of metrics from the 2012 work plans in order to focus on undergraduates. We're trying to keep the number of those metrics and tools to a handful of 5, 6, 7, and focus on key performance issues such as graduation rates, retention rates, some of the issues that we actually heard about yesterday during the Strategic Planning Committee. The model that we're looking at will also take into account excellence, improvement, things of that nature, and some of those become definitional, and we'll talk about those at a later meeting. So by excellence, what threshold is applicable for excellence? Is it a 90% graduation rate? Is it an 80% graduation rate? Is it an improvement measurement that says you've improved your graduation rate by 3% over the course of a year? So there's some parameters that we're trying to discuss and some metrics that we're trying to determine in order to, A, come up with reasonable metrics, and then B, quantify those metrics in some objective, fair, or other manner so that we can apply those across the university system. So we're working independently with Tim. We'll start noticing our meetings in Orlando to talk about these things over the next month or so, and hopefully we'll have something to share with the committee at our meeting in November. Tom, do you have anything to add?
Maybe just a little. I think it's a very worthwhile exercise we're going through independently, as you say, but I think our objective is consistent and try to have a little system to follow. But I would say that what we're not trying to do is at least what I am not trying to do is develop a formula, but more what are the key metrics to serve as a guideline, because you can't substitute judgment at the same time. And so I think if we end up with some key metrics that include graduation rates and retention and employment numbers, focusing on jobs, I'll consider that to be a victory. But again, that does not mean that we just fill out a form or you would fill out a form and send it in and that the outcome would be predetermined based on a strict formula. And so there'll be a balance of fewer metrics with some guidelines as to how a process should work, and then we'll still have, I'm sure, a good, robust discussion each time we gather to talk about this as well. So
I think it's a safe bet to conclude that it will still remain an art and not a science.
Correct.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
That's all I'd like to say about that. No.
I do have just one comment, and I'm sure that you're looking into this, but one thing I think that may be helpful is can you also provide some guidance just on timing? That is, are we looking at this at the right time? Should it start earlier or anything like that? I know that's your expert, it's probably on the list. I just wanted to make sure and comment on it.
Yeah, and Governor Parker, we have talked to the universities about that in the past. We'll revisit with them again in the future. Part of it's driven by the board's own agenda. We've got the fee discussions, we've got the differential tuition discussions, and we need to wait until the legislature has acted in order to determine. So we've got a very short window in which to act after the session ends before we can move forward on those differential requests. So we've scheduled it as promptly as humanly possible after the legislative session to give the universities as much time as possible for fall. But no doubt, it's a tight window. If the legislature will move their dates back a couple months, it will make it easier. Not sure they're willing to do that.
I think
for
there's
us.
a high likelihood.
I think we
that'll
could
happen,
ask
Governor.
them, but I'm not sure. But yeah, I understand it is an absolute time crunch for the universities. Okay, let's go ahead and move on with the rest of the agenda.
Mr. Chairman, can I?
Yes, Governor Husseini,
I'm not on the committee, but
you are always welcome.
thank you. Is it fair, Mr. Chairman, to, for us to have conversations with our presidents of what we are looking for going forward? What does this board look, to approve? In the past, I think if you go back to history, we usually, if you look at the last 4 or 5 years, every year we looked at a 15% increase, and we went through and we did it every year, and 74% or 71%, however you look at it, increase in tuition. And as we saw in June, and our chairman will shiver, as I mentioned, and this, we had a very spirited discussion, a conversation, and something is really interesting. When I came out of the meeting, somebody mentioned to me that, are you ever going to talk to some of the board members again? What people don't know is we're all friends, and during the day, we do our business, and once we leave this room, we are friends again. And but I think we ought to, and I think from the conversation that went on, I think it's fair to say that many of us on the board, and that we are interested, we're no longer interested just to go and say, okay, you want 15%, here you go. We'll give you 15%. I think not only on the side of tuition, but also any type of extra budget, other things that the universities are interested. We want to be helpful. We want to help our universities. Our universities are near and dear to our heart, and it is the economic engine of any community. Look at this university. I'm just so proud of this university. See what has happened. And so they're the economic engine of our state. With that said, we only have limited amount of money, and that we can give out, and we also can only force our students to pay extra more and more every year. And so is it fair to say that we're going to be looking at every program? We're no longer going to be a carte blanche giving 15%. We're looking at return on investment. We're looking at when our students graduate, do they get a job or not?
Yeah, Governor, I think those are exactly some of the metrics that we're talking about looking at, and rest assured, we will be absolutely consulting with the presidents and the provosts with regard to some of the metrics that we're looking at. What we want to do, and I think Tom put it best, I mean, this is not going to be a formulaic process. This is going to be some metrics that we can determine as some starting points, some measuring tools, to then have our conversation and weigh in a lot of the factors that you're talking about, Governor.
Mr. Chairman,
Chancellor.
and one thing we haven't talked about is also personalizing the metrics. Some of the metrics are standard, graduation rates, retention rates for everybody who does undergraduate education. But this is also an opportunity to continue to tease out the differentiated missions of each of the universities, those things that make Florida State University different from Florida Gulf Coast University, and provide some metric evidence to that effect within this process as well. So this can serve a number of different purposes beyond just setting the differential tuition component.
Right, and I think the work plans will weigh heavily into those conversations. Okay. Anything else on that informational item? Okay. Seeing none.
I hope you are here next year.
Okay, the second item on the agenda is the approval of our June 21st committee meeting minutes. The minutes are in your package. There's a motion
Second.
and a second to approve. Any discussion? Seeing none, all in favor, please say aye. Aye. Motion carries. Item 3 is our amended board regulations. We have several regulations that we are noticing as an intent to amend. Again, this is an intent to amend. If you've all been briefed on them, if we approve these as written, they will then be posted, there will be comment, and we will subsequently amend them. I'm going to ask Tim Jones from our staff to help us through or navigate these processes. First, Tim, would you talk to us about public notice of intent to amend Regulation 7.003 on fees, fines, and penalties, the provision that we seem to amend every third meeting?
That is true. It's come before this committee quite often. You actually saw a draft of this regulation at your June meeting, and at that time, we were looking at changing the submission and consideration dates for new fees from March to June. We were also looking at clarifying what the new fee could be used for in terms of new services or activities and not to supplant existing programs. So those were the two primary changes associated with that regulation. We did go out at the request of the committee and see what kind of hardships that would provide to the universities. Most of them indicated that, that would provide some challenges in terms of notifying students, making tweaks to systems, but it was manageable. There was a couple of institutions who preferred not to change because of those same issues.
And this is a timing issue we're talking
It's really
about.
a timing issue in terms of
Right.
notifying students and getting processes in place to bill the students for any new fees that may be approved. But in my opinion, the concerns didn't outweigh the opportunity to change the fee or the timeline.
Gotcha. Thank you, Tim and Governor Parker. This goes a long way towards what you were talking about. I mean, it's just, it's trying to adjust this time schedule so that it makes sense for everyone. Are there any questions for Tim with regard to, Governor Coons?
I think that's a good idea. I'm just curious, as you said, the concerns didn't outweigh the benefits. And so, on that scale, were the concerns that you heard, I mean, where did they register on the map of how serious those concerns are?
Well, the couple institutions who weighed in that would provide some issues for them didn't say it couldn't be done. It would just be a very compressed time frame to get the notices out, get the systems changed. One of the things that they could consider is going ahead and getting their systems ready, because they're going to submit the information to us in March, so they'll have some time to get prepared under the assumption that it would be approved, then they could be ready to go. If it's not approved, then you just don't implement it.
I guess the danger of that is, at least based in recent history, it might be a poor assumption to spend a lot of time assuming something's going to get approved, but I take your point.
That's an option.
Any further questions or comments? Seeing none, is there a motion to approve our intent to amend? There is a motion and a second. Any additional discussion? Seeing none, all in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
And the motion carries. Tim, would you talk about public notice of intent to repeal Regulation 7.015?
Yes, sir. This is a regulation we implemented a few years ago. It's for the Florida National Guard Educational Assistance Program. The statute was modified to remove the Board of Governors and the State Board of Education from implementing this program and moved it to the Department of Military Affairs, in which they're responsible for it. So this is just a repeal of that regulation.
Just in compliance with the statute from the legislature. Any questions for Tim with regard to this item? If not, is there a motion? There's a motion to approve in a second the public notice of intent to repeal Regulation 7.015. Any additional discussion? Seeing none, all in favor, please say aye. Aye. Motion carries. Tim, the third one, public notice of intent to amend Regulation 7.008.
Yes, sir. This is our waiver regulation. It had a reference to the previous regulation we just repealed, so this is a technical modification.
Great. Any questions for Tim with regard to this? If
So
not,
moved.
there's a motion. Governor Coons, second. Any further discussion? Seeing none, all in favor of the motion, please say aye.
Aye.
And opposed. Motion carries. Let's move into item number 4 of the agenda. This is kind of the meat. Well, we're starting the meat anyway. The State University System Optional Retirement Program. I don't know if many of you remember at the last meeting, we did talk about this a little bit. Tim came up and made a brief presentation, warned us that we were going to be asked by DMS, the Department of Management Services, to weigh in on the optional retirement plans vendors that we're proposing for the state university system. We asked Tim at that time to meet with CAFA, which is the Council of Administrative and Financial Affairs Officers, to assist us in that conversation. It essentially relates to them and their folks. We thought it made some good sense. Tim, can you report back, please, on the results of your meeting with CAFA and make any presentation you'd like?
Yes, sir. Just as a reminder to this committee, we currently have 5 vendors that provide programs to over about 17,000 state employees. University employees. The legislation increased the number of vendors from 5 to 6, so we're in the process of trying to select that 6th vendor. The statute requires the board to give to the Department of Management Service some recommendations on what they would like a new vendor to bring forward in terms of services. We did go out to CAFA and ask for their recommendations on this, and we have Dr. Ken Jessel representing CAFA here to provide their recommendation to the committee.
Great. Dr. Jessel, welcome.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Tim actually gave part of my report. We have had since 1984, 5 ORP vendors that were under a 30-year contract, and that contract is for all of them, will be coming up in December of 2014. So January 1, 2015, we will have a new set of vendors. This board, since 2008, has attempted to add an additional vendor that has been part of this board's legislative budget request, and we are happy that this past session we were able to get the 6th vendor added. So DMS is going to begin a competitive process for that 6th vendor, where that contract will run through the remainder of the period ending December 31st, 2014. So in essence, it'll be an 18-month contract, July 1, 2013 to December 31st, 2014. At the same time, they will begin a competitive process for all 6 vendors to be included in the period that will begin on January 1, 2015. I will tell you that even though these were 30-year contracts, those vendors have been very responsive to the needs of our faculty and staff in the state university system. You can imagine in 1984, the few products that they offer are pretty much annuities under insurance companies, but they've added, real estate investments, small cap fixed income, global investments, and the like, to really reflect the needs in the marketplace and reflect also the importance of diversification in their portfolios. So overall, when you look at their array of products, we're very pleased with what they have offered and how they've responded to legislative changes as well over the last 30 years. We would request, as we did a few years ago when this issue first came up to this board, that the 6th vendor be a mutual fund company to give a low-fee option to our employees. We think that would complement the existing 5 companies that we currently have. And of course, we don't know what will happen during the competitive process for all 6. But we are pleased that we will have representatives from the Board of Governors on that selection committee, as well as representatives from the university system. Obviously, we are concerned about the completeness of the programs. We are concerned about disclosures of fees and cost, as well as ensuring that we have appropriate local representation, either in the community or at the institution, where prospective employees and current employees can meet with their financial advisors to discuss the various products and changes to their portfolio mix as they get closer and closer to retirement. So we're very pleased with the process that has been proposed by DMS. We don't see any major changes in the various products, and we do look forward to having the 6th vendor to support our faculty and staff in the ORP program.
Thank you, Dr. Jessel. Are there any questions for Dr. Jessel or Tim on this topic.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes,
I'm not on the committee, but may I
you're
ask?
more than welcome.
Dr. Jessel,
Yes.
as we increase the number of vendors during the open enrollment period, is there a chance to migrate from one to the other for existing ORP members?
I don't believe they can migrate from one to the other, and this is something that we have actually talked about in the past. Universities do have supplemental programs. So, for example, there are many more than 5 for the voluntary employee contributions that are made. And we did try to get some changes to not require the full employee match on the existing vendor before going to the supplemental, and that may be something that we would try again in the legislature, because it would give the ability to have additional diversification by not having all of your funds invested in one particular provider. So yes, that is something we have discussed in the past. We tried to get through in 2009 that change, and perhaps as part of the negotiation process for this year, we could get that.
Thank you.
Thanks, Governor Chopa. Any other questions for Dr. Jessel?
Mr. Chairman, I was simply going to say, if you can imagine in 1984, when these companies got a 30-year contract, they probably thought they were set for life. Time flies when you're having fun, and I think this is an example. Now, we have a unique window of opportunity, not only in adding the 6th vendor, that's one, and as Dr. Jessel mentioned, even by adding one, we have the ability to diversify the options for the employees. But more importantly, we have the chance to rewrite the rules going forward for the next 30 years.
Right.
And even though this is sort of sounds a bit mundane, to our employees, this is critical. This is an economic impact of mammoth proportion for our employees. So we do want to be represented in this process and make certain that if there are opportunities to bend the approach we took 30 years ago for the next 30 years to the betterment of the system and therefore the benefit of our employees, then more the better.
And Mr. Chairman, I don't believe we'll be looking at 30-year contracts as
Yeah.
part of this process.
I think that's probably right, Dr. Jessel. Okay, any other questions for Dr. Jessel? If not, is there a motion to accept the recommendation from CAFA?
Second.
Motion and a second. Any additional discussion? Seeing none, all in favor, please say aye. Aye. Recommendation passes. Dr. Jessel, thank you, and please thank CAFA for taking up this conversation at our request. We just thought it was a lot better for you all to put eyes on it. You certainly have a keen vested interest in the appropriate outcome, so we thank you for that. Let's move to agenda item number 5. It's our 2012-2013 operating budgets for both the State University System and the Board General Office. This will be the first time we're looking at our board office budget. Our board's master powers and duties require us to, as you know, and as we've done for the last 5 or 6 years, approve the university's operating budgets. Tim is going to give us an overview on the operating budgets and the system budgets. But while we're at it, I've also asked him to just update us on the carry-forward balances of each of the universities. As you know, that was obviously a big issue in the last legislative session, and it was the basis for the one-time budget cut, budget reduction, let me say, of $300 million, which we've been assured will be put back in the budget this year by the legislature. That's what they promised us. So I wanted to make sure that we knew what university plans were for addressing the $300 million cut this year and what the impact will be on carry-forward balances from those universities, as well as those universities' plans, if they have any left in that balance, on spending that out over the next several years. So, Tim, I know you've got a PowerPoint presentation for all of us.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Since some of your committee is new, I'll probably go into a little more detail than I normally do on these annual approvals.
All we got is time, Tim.
I know you got until 11:30, so. Each board of trustees does adopt an operating budget. They do that generally towards the end of the previous fiscal year. As the chair said, our approval is subject to the board's master powers and duties. We have reviewed all their budget submissions, and they conform to our regulation, and they all have indicated compliance with the state's 5% reserve. I do want to point out that if at any time during the year their balances would drop below 5%, they are supposed to notify the board. So in your packet, starting on page 183, is a summary of the system operating budget. Behind that summary are each individual university's operating budgets. So here's an overview of the system budget, $10.8 billion, slightly higher than it was last year when we visited this issue. Our budget is broken into what we call 5 budget entities. First, we have contracts and grants, which makes up about $2.4 billion of the budget. This is where they house funding received from primarily federal grants, NIH or NSF, but also state or local grants. The next budget entities are auxiliaries, about $1.5 billion. This is your housing, parking, food services, bookstores, your self-supporting enterprises that support the institution. Next, we have local funds, which is about $2.6 billion. This is where we have a variety of, I won't say miscellaneous funds, but like your athletic fees or the local fees that this board has approved, the green fee, technology fee, financial aid, Pell grants. They're all housed in the local fund budget entity. And then we have faculty practice. This is for our medical program. This is revenue received from patient services that are then distributed back and used on the campus in the medical programs. The biggest program really that we're interested in is the education in general portion of the budget. This is what we'll be looking at later on in terms of the LBR request. But this is where your basic instruction goes on. You have your tuition, which is about 15% of the total budget, then state funds, which is slightly higher than that. So that's the primary instruction budget for the system. The other funds, you can see by the note, those are funds that are really restricted to those budget entities. I mean, you can't really take a contract or grant program, the dollars associated with the program, and use that to fund your basic instruction. So there are some silos associated with the overall budget. Quickly on fund balances, as the chair mentioned, $300 million was cut from the system this year as a result of having about $1 billion in reserves this time a year ago. The blue bar shows where everyone is starting on July 1. So they entered the fiscal year with fairly high fund balances. Then the red bar is where they plan on ending up as of June 30 of 2013 as they begin to cover the $300 million cut that goes into effect. All the universities are using some of their carry forward funds to cover that cut, except for Florida Gulf Coast, which is having to make some cuts to their base so they can make sure they maintain their 5% reserve. As they move along, they've told me that they may have to dip into their carry forward funds a little bit just to cover important services. So, Mr. Chair, that's where we stand on carry forward balances. We're going to be asking updates from the institutions on a quarterly basis as they spend those dollars down. So when we get closer to the end of the fiscal year and the session, we'll know where each institution stands.
Mr. Chair, just a fine point, most people are aware of this, but I think it's a detail, but it's an important one. Just a reminder that those reserve funds are non-recurring revenue. Once they are spent, they are gone. And so as you see that bar dip, and in some cases dip precariously low, if you look at Florida Gulf Coast to that 5% reserve, it isn't as easy as saying that can be replenished on an annualized basis. Those are non-recurring dollars. That's why the chair's comment about that $300 million, which was billed as a non-recurring cut to the system, is so important, because once those reserve dollars are gone, they are gone.
Well, and I also need to add, Chancellor, and thank you for that point, but additionally, many of the dollars in that fund are already committed dollars out in future years. They have not, they're already spent dollars, they just have not been spent yet. So as we see those numbers and we see those funds, we need to understand that that's not a pot of, it's not a savings account. That is, those are committed multi-year dollars that have got to be in place and be spent eventually.
Mr. Chair, on that point, because that was true last year as well, many of those dollars were committed dollars.
Absolutely, it was true.
Like I look at UCF, and looks like it's got 80 or $85 million in reserves. Where is that relative to their 5%? And how much in excess of that? And if somebody would look at that?
The 5% will be non-committed dollars, and I've met with and am working with each of the CFOs to get an understanding of that, Governor Colson. But I will tell you, I don't think any of these universities is running fat in their reserve funds at this point in time, based upon their spending plan for the next 2 or 3 years to make up for the cuts, as well as the committed funds that are already committed. Everybody's pretty narrow right now.
Mr. Chair, or Tim, I want to make sure I got the chart right. So could you put a line on where is 5% for each university on this chart to see where they end up the year, or is that kind of apples and oranges?
Well, it will vary by institution, but yeah, we know.
And I guess what I'm wondering is, come the end of the year, and we've got it the 5%.
Right, what's over the 5%?
Yeah, what's over the 5%, who's right at it, and, I guess nobody should end up below it, because you're not allowed to end up below it, but, we got ourselves in a situation, it seemed last year, where there was a lot of differences from one university to the other as to where you were versus the 5%, and it'd just be interesting to see, does everybody end up 5.01%, or are some higher than that?
Yeah, but it's more of a it's more of a measure than that, Governor Coons, because a lot of those funds are tied up in commitments that are through multi-years, and so the 5% is a required statutory baseline, but because it's in that account doesn't mean it's not spent, incurred, all money that's already committed. It's just in that account because it hasn't been spent in that particular year, but it's committed for future and out years. So again, we are constantly speaking with.
So can you end up with? Could somebody be at 5%, but that 5% is already committed, or are you saying if you're at 10%, the 5 to the 10% is what's already committed to?
5 to the 10% would be already committed.
So what? I guess then what I'm asking is to better understand where is each university above the 5%, and is that committed or not?
Right.
Right. I mean, that sounds like that's what you've been talking about.
Shouldn't there be another account? I mean, if it's committed, does it have to?
Yeah.
I mean,
that would be great.
I mean,
but there's not. But if there were, that would be ideal.
My bank would make me set it aside. I mean,
Residents would like that.
Yeah, there wouldn't be the illusion of largesse if that were the case.
But can we create another account of committed money that's legally committed? I mean, I'm just.
I think what we have the ability to do, I think the short answer is no, not under the current requirements, correct, Tim? The money has to go in that account.
You have commitments and you have legal encumbrances.
But
What you have here is a lot of commitments, but they're not legally encumbered.
Yeah.
But the universities all know what's committed versus.
Right. That was going to be my next point. Having said that, under the current requirements, I think what we can do is shed a greater light on what is the difference between the 5% requirement and the other dollars.
Yeah,
even in the same category, bring greater clarity to the difference.
And then as far as these commitments, I assume that the future commitments cannot be made without the awareness of the local boards as well as this board.
Well, at least the local board.
Well, this board wouldn't this board see a review of those commitments, and the local board would have made the commitments?
Not necessarily. We'd see it in the budget program that we're looking for. But when a new faculty member comes in and there's a commitment for a lab 2 years down the road, we're never going to see that, Governor Coons. I mean, that's the Board of Trustees and the deans and department heads who would see that. He's Governor.
Mr. Chairman, I just wanted to ask a question. In this context, we were just talking earlier with President Benston talking about the facilities and going forward and being a little bit more creative and giving some greater flexibilities to the universities. Why not look at the opportunity to ask in the legislature, if we don't have authority, give us the authority to allow the university to say, this is, we have this in this omnibus account, which is a misnomer.
Yes.
Let's put these resources in a category that allow us to say, these are committed. These are matching funds for different programs that we've gotten private dollars for. These are the programs that are committed. So we don't have this thing where you may have someone in the legislature, God bless them, that will say, well, you've got X amount of dollars here. We need to do a sweep there. Well, we don't really have X amount of dollars there. We actually have, you're looking at a factor of 10, but really the only thing we have in here is like maybe $1 that's not committed. So maybe we could look at, in the context of governing, that we could give the universities greater flexibility. So
I think the presidents would be thrilled with that, and let me ask Tim and our legislative team to see what it would take to do that. It would be almost the creation of an committed and encumbered account, because they're two different things, legally committed and subsequently encumbered funds that we've promised. But a committed and encumbered account, I know we can do some kind of a bookkeeping entry, but when you look at funds, this is what you will see, and that's why it appeared to be $1 billion of largesse last year and painted a target on it, when in fact that wasn't what existed. So maybe we can take a look at what it might take, Tim, in order to create that kind of a bookkeeping account. Governor Parker.
I have a couple of comments. One is that certainly Governor Carter, just your experience in the legislature could be very helpful in us coming up with the best way to lay that out based upon your work with the budget and with the legislators. One thing I wouldn't want to do is to create this concept and be surprised about what we find and find that we're putting universities in a worse position. I don't think that's going to be the case, but that is something that I would like some feedback from the presidents on. You kind of see what we're discussing, and whether or not at the end of the day this is something that would be beneficial, or would it create?
Governor Parker, you're exactly right, and we would certainly never come out with any proposal without consulting with and speaking with the presidents. I mean, at the end of the day, these reserve funds are grown slowly, painfully, by not filling positions if there's an urgent need not to fill a position, by cutting costs and saving money and saving for rainy days and anticipating challenges in the future. And they're important to be there so that our universities can even out the uncertainties of funding and challenges that may come and payments that have to happen after hurricanes before insurance proceeds come in, and all of those various issues that they've got to deal with. So we will certainly consult with the presidents before we would make any kind of proposal. But I do think it would be interesting to at least have an understanding, as Governor Coons is talking about, of, okay, here's our 5% number, here's our encumbered and committed number, and here's the number that we've got some flexibility in planning with. I think that would make some good sense.
Can I ask, Mr. Chairman, I don't know if there are any kind of immediate thoughts about that now that any of the presidents have. I don't know if it would be appropriate. I don't know, because I know you know how long our agenda is, but if any of the presidents have any thoughts about it now, is it okay for us to entertain some of those comments?
Presidents are always welcome to speak and share their ideas.
I just see a couple of
Governor, President Pence.
Well, I think it's a great idea. It would really help us out, because sometimes not only do we need money to even out, we commit it, like we're buying Banner, another module of Banner, which is multi-million dollars, and we don't have it in ENG, but we do have it in the combination of auxiliaries and carry forward. We're in the middle of the process. We make huge payments every year, to which we must honor that. And our margins now are, I'm not worried, but I mean, that's an example of something that's a university-wide need. Another thing crossed my mind when you were saying, Governor Perez, about how slowly carry forward builds up. I'm amazed at sometimes how surprisingly quickly it will build up. When we get an appropriation for a program, you can't hire everybody right away. And so you have a buildup of carry forward that will take you a few years to spend down as your program gets online. So that has kind of caught us off guard a little bit too. So there are a couple ways that carry forward can build up. One is slowly and painfully, and the other is kind of in lumps. But I would definitely favor the committed encumbered account as one of our bookkeeping options or tools in our tools box to identify those funds which we are going to use for the university, but haven't yet, which otherwise would be classified as carry forward.
Thank you, President Pence. President Barron?
Yeah, I agree. I think it would make an enormous difference. And I'll give you an example. The university is in the process of switching over all of its software systems. It's a multi-year, multi-million-dollar effort. We were petrified that in the middle of switching over all those software accounts, we would get a budget cut that wouldn't allow us to complete the job. Nothing could be more disastrous. So we made sure that we had the cash to get it done. That's a commitment over a 3-year process.
Right.
But if we had taken our numbers down to some level and all of a sudden had a budget cut, I mean, how would the university have managed that? Certainly, it's also true that when you're hiring STEM faculty and you're building labs, these labs can be quite expensive. And if you're doing a large number of those, and it takes them 2 or 3 years to bring all that together, and you can't pull the rug out from under them. So that's a committed category that's in there. So it's not really carry forward at all. The other thing that I would tell you from my perspective is I think a 5% is dangerous in this budget environment. And the chief reason is because this is a system that has taken cut after cut after cut. And how do you operate when you take the cut and you hope the next year won't be a cut? Well, you start nickel and diming all your programs, and you take a little bit here and you take a little bit there. And you finally get to the point where all of a sudden you sit there and say, I'm starting to affect the quality of the entire institution. I'm going to have to take some big piece off the table. If we do that, accreditation requires us to have teach-outs for 2 years. And that means if I come to the bottom of my budget and all of a sudden I have to knock out a $10 million program and I wipe out a whole college, I have to have $20 million in the bank.
Right.
And I didn't have the money was cut right then, and I have to have $20 million in order to follow through. So that one example of taking out a full $10 million college to manage a budget cut, because I don't know where else to get it, would take my entire legal reserve as a commitment. And so that number, 5%, is actually, in this budget climate of year after year cuts, that's a very dangerous number, in my opinion.
I think you're exactly right, Mr. President, and I will tell you, and I'll tell you later when we get into the LBR request, the state has asked us once again to prepare a budget with a 5% cut for planning purposes. Again, so, you are right that a 5% reserve is a very small cushion for us to operate from. But I think we've got a sense that it's a conversation worth having, and Tim, I'm going to ask you to lead that conversation over the next couple of weeks and months. Governor Beard, you had a comment.
Yeah, I just had a question and a comment. In President Bentz's committee, we talked about this very issue of using reserves. You've got a roof that's broke, that's leaking, or a major installation that needs to be fixed. And right now, we can't use those reserves, as I understand it.
Very limited.
Very limited. So, why wouldn't you be able to go fix something that's going to cost millions if you don't immediately? So all of those things are being talked about in the committee. And secondly, I just want to make sure that institutionally, if we get this $300 million given back to us, that it goes back where it came from.
When we get it.
When we get it is right.
We get it, yeah.
I say when.
Governor Tripp.
Just a quick question. Could you look back and find out why it is the way it is today?
Yeah, I think...
So we don't get surprised and get down a road and find out that there was a specific reason why this process was in place. I'd like to know that, so that if we're going to attempt to change it, we have the answers of why it may have worked years ago, but it won't work now.
I think that's a good point, Governor Tripp, and I think Tim will ask you to do that in the process, because we asked him to do everything in the process. President Roosevelt.
Governor, I'd like to reverse this if I could and pose a question to you and other board members based upon a mandate that my board chair gave to us at FIU. He indicated to us when we reviewed this that he was very uncomfortable with us running lean, going down to 5%, and essentially told us we had to have more in our reserves. Is that a good idea or a bad idea in these circumstances, to have more, to be sitting on more, to be more efficient, more prudent, more cautious, more careful? Is that a good idea or a bad idea?
generally and in business, Mr. President, you know that's a good idea. Unfortunately, it tends to paint a target on you. So, I mean, I think part of what we need to consider is whether or not we request that 5% reserve requirement be elevated to a level that's more appropriate to the current and possibly future business climate as we move forward. Madam President.
When Governor Beard was chair of our board, we instituted an 8% reserve, and we've kept that ever since 2001. So we have mandated by our Board of Trustees a 3% addition on the 5%.
At that time, we never expected the legislature to steal it from us either.
That's true.
I think the reappropriate is the proper word there, Governor.
The minutes will be.
Let me leave the conversation on that note.
They borrowed it.
We'll leave the conversation on that note, and Tim, please continue.
We will work with CAFA on better defining the different buckets and report back to the committee at another meeting.
Okay. Is this the end of your presentation, Tim? No, there's more.
I just have the board general office. We have a $6 million budget for the current year. Most of our budget is in the salaries and benefits category, which is the biggest slice of the pie. These categories are standard state categories that all agencies operate under. Our next biggest categories are expenses. The two primary drivers of our expense budget is travel and rent. We actually pay about $300,000 a year for the 16th floor of the Turlington building. In your packet, there's some further detailed information on the types of things that the board spends its dollars on, and this would include the additional $300,000 that we had received this year for the online university study that we're doing at the current time.
Great. Thank you, Tim. Are there any additional questions for Tim with regard to either the operating budgets or the board office budget?
Mr. Chairman, can I ask
Governor
a question?
Hussain.
I was just talking to Charlie Edwards outside, and they all just came back from Texas, and he was telling me about the Board of Regents over there, that how, you know, the board members get flown with the jets, and they all have their own offices and all that.
Reimburse your mileage. Reimburse your mileage now, Governor. What more would you like?
They actually had their own apartments.
Yes.
No. This ain't Texas. All right. I'm going to be looking for two motions at this point, if there are no additional suggestions, Governor Hussaini. Motion number one, may I have a motion to approve the 2012-2013 university operating budgets? There's a motion and a second. Is there any additional discussion? And I want to make sure everyone is aware we've all been fully briefed by staff on these in addition to this presentation. Motion and a second. Any additional discussion? Seeing none, all in favor of the motion, please say aye. Aye. And opposed. Motion carries. And the next is a motion to approve the 2012-2013 operating budget for the board office. And I want to authorize Chancellor Brogan to make whatever budgetary changes are necessary throughout the course of the year to operate that office on this budget.
Does that include jets and apartments?
No, well, if you dare. There's a motion and a second. Is there any additional discussion on the board operating budget? Seeing none, all in favor, please say aye. Aye. And opposed. Motion carries. Let's move into agenda item number 6, which is the 2013-2014 legislative budget requests, our actual LBRs. We'll be talking about two of them, one from the state university system and again, the board general office budget. Before we get into our LBR requests, I've asked Governor Whatley to make a brief presentation to us on a student initiative that's being driven right now. It's a fascinating initiative that the students have taken up. I think it's going to tie nicely into our own LBR. So, Governor Whatley, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair Perez. This is going to be very brief. I won't take up too much of your time. Board members and I believe presidents as well, in front of you, you have our two-page document on the initiative that we as the Florida Student Association have adopted and also led by the University, Student Body President at the University of Florida. And I'd like to thank Ms. Janet Owen for assisting in actually preparing these documents for you today. I'm not going to read what is on the text in front of you because obviously everyone in here is very competent and can read this their own. But the only things I will mention are, I want to just go over the goals of the initiative. It's very simple, and I think in this instance, we're using simplicity as the main driver of this initiative because it's very straightforward. Raise the awareness about the importance of investing in higher education and encourage the Florida State Legislature to increase funding for higher education and prioritize higher education in the state budget for subsequent years. This is an initiative that is going to be emotionally driven. We are using all the social media outlets at our disposal, including, I think, at the Blue Ribbon Task Force Committee, a presentation was given to the presidents and to all those that attended that had hard facts and numbers, all of which we know, but also are going to include all the student body presidents and their staffs are composing, putting together videos of our campuses, sort of what they offer, sort of our student experience, so that when presenting this, everyone can kind of see what goes on at different campuses, and as well as incorporating the different universities into the entire message. So if you flip to the second page, you'll see this is just an example from UNF, but they have created a t-shirt that has the entire message of the AIM Higher initiative, but also is personalized through the university with their mascot, and it's going to be something that all the universities work together to incorporate as well, to individually mobilize our campuses, but to also make sure that it's under the guise and under the initiative of this AIM Higher Florida. So it's a very brief presentation, and I would entertain any questions that come up, but this is sort of what we're doing, and so we just wanted to let everyone know, so once you start hearing about it, you're not surprised as to what the idea is. So.
Thank you, Governor Wiley. And what's exciting about it is we're getting a lot of student energy behind this, and these are the same students and student body presidents who have concurred with tuition increases over the last several years. I mean, they've got skin in the game. They've stood up and said, we want higher quality. We'll pay our share. Please pay your share. And they're absolutely going to push this agenda very strong for us. And coming from them, I think it's going to be a very strong message, especially with the credibility of having skin in the game in the past. They've not blocked things. They've not complained. They've been partners in the process, and I'm excited that it's moving forward this way. Governor Parker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just have one question, Governor, or some question about Governor Watley. Have you guys decided what kinds of things you're going to do in order to promote the campaign?
Yes, like I briefly mentioned, right now we have asked for submissions from all the universities for videos on their campuses, which will be spread out through YouTube. We'll also be making, it'll be a combination of different videos. The website is to be fully launched, I believe, in a couple of weeks, and that is obviously going to have more statistics and more data, and it's going to be a huge social media campaign, and one that is going to just be circulated and hopefully get very viral very quickly. And so that's sort of the things that have already been taking place and are going to continue.
And have all the universities signed on to participate?
Yes, we at our conference meeting in August from FSA, it was something that the organization adopted, and with that adoption, all the universities have agreed to, student body presidents have agreed to work on this project, and so it's something that we're all working on right now. So.
And would this be something that's separate and apart from the rally and tally, or would this be, tell me how that works.
Thank you, I was actually meant to mention that. This is something that we're actually going to combine with our rally and tally. So as one of the points that we go and lobby on, this is going to be our central focus. So something that, while we're in Tallahassee, it will be our rally and tally, but our goal is to make sure that we are presenting the message that we are looking for additional funding, that we are looking for the legislature to reprioritize and invest in our education.
And then as one final question, Mr. Chairman, I know that as a part of Governor Perez's comments, he indicated that part of this initiative is, one, to get the legislature to do more, but there's also a belief that the students are willing to pay their fair share and do more too. So I guess my question is that, is a part of this the idea that, that tuition increases is something that students are willing to support, I guess to continue to support? I guess I want to make sure, because what I get from this is more from the
Let me correct
legislature.
my statement was, in the past, the students have been supportive of tuition increases, as we saw last time and the last several times. So they come at it with credibility. I don't think they've made any statements on a go-forward basis as of yet.
So I wanted to clarify. Thank you.
Sure, Governor. Let me get to a couple presidents. I'll come right back to you. President Hitt.
I'm sure it will come as a surprise to absolutely no one that the president's support aim higher. We had a dinner meeting last night, and all of us except President Delaney were there, and the support was unanimous. We commend Governor Whatley and his student body president colleagues for their actions, and will back them fully.
Great. President Rosenberg.
At the meeting this summer in July that was that Dale Brill ran, the State Higher Education Task Force, was largely focused on university. There were a significant number of student leaders there, and what was remarkable about that was that there was they did not push back on higher tuition. I mean, the issue, as you point out, Governor Perez, for most of the student leaders there was a quality education. So I thought what was remarkable was what wasn't said there by students. As it relates to what their mainstream concerns were for their educations.
Governor Tripp.
Earlier, when you made a presentation, I think you showed that presently tuition is 15% of the budget, and state support is now 16%.
That's right, Governor.
The problem with that pie is that students are really paying more, and I think what we need to do is bundle it together as you're showing really what your fair share and your skin in the game is. Because in addition to the tuition, you're paying fees, you're paying much of the auxiliary revenue, and I'm sure if we break it out, there are a number of other things that are directly coming from the students. And I think when we make the presentations and show these pies, if we don't add on the real cost to the student versus what the state is putting now, we talk about, do they really have skin in the game? I think they have gotten a lot of skin in the game now, and we need to reflect that, and especially if they're going to step up and say, we'll pay even more. I mean, if that's their position and they're willing to do that, then we need to be able to use that as a selling point about the people that are going to carry the state forward are not being cheapskates on what they're doing. And I hope you could change that somehow to reflect that, and you could use that in this program.
I think that would make a lot of sense, Tim, as we take a look at the pies. But Governor Tripp, I want to say again, I did not intend, if I did, to put any words in Governor Whatley's mouth. I don't think they have said they're willing to pay more in the future. I think they haven't looked at that issue yet. What I've said is they have agreed in the past to these tuition increases and not raise the issue. I don't want anyone to come away from this meeting with the impression that Governor Whatley has represented that students are behind tuition increases for next year. I don't think he said that, and I certainly didn't mean to say that on his behalf if that was interpreted. Governor Hussaini.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just 2 points. One is that President Rosenberg brought up that the students are for quality education, so as the board. But we also look at the dashboard, so we're interested, we're also interested for the same thing, for the quality education. But what's the quality education? What's the graduation rate? How are you graduating? How are students getting jobs? What's the percentage of your STEM? If you have only 15% and you're going to be 15% 5 years from now, that's not quality. I mean, so we have the same interests as our students do. And the same as what Board of Trustees do, is just that we are looking to increase that quality, and we're willing to pay for the quality. And I think that's what legislators ought to look at that. And they should not put on the shoulder of our students, because that other states have higher tuition. That doesn't mean we ought to have higher tuitions. We should not put it on our students' shoulders, every year. So they ought to also consider. So there is two-pronged. One is that we believe it should not be all put on our students' shoulders, which it has been in the last few years, one. And the second thing is we have not seen growth in what you have just said, the quality. And I think our because I've had a conversation with you, Mr. President, and I think you mentioned it, that you get it, and you all are working on the quality. At one point of time, the numbers of students in a given university maybe was very big. We want to be 100,000 students. We want to be a number one university. To me at least, no longer that is the highest of, to me, the quality of education is the most important, and for us to be able, for whatever we deliver, get the return on investment that we made in our education.
Great. Thanks, Governor. I want to move into the LBR. Governor Wiley, anything to add in closing?
Actually, can I just conclude very briefly? I know you mentioned it, but I would also like just to state that, of course, this is not in any way us committing to any increases or support of increasing in tuition, actually asking the opposite in that we are looking for the $300 million that was reduced in the state budget, and also plus some. So that is our initiative and our goals. So.
Thank you, Governor Raleigh. And the students are stepping up. They're going to get active, and they're going to market this campaign in ways that we would not have thought about moving forward.
Mr. Chairman, this is a commendable effort, and I see the faculty not involved yet, but we would like to work with you on this as well. So through the board staff, I'll work with you on that.
We can do it. Thank you.
That would be great. Okay, let's go ahead and move into the LBR presentations. Each month, we continue to get emails from Tim. He's kept the committee up to date on monthly revenue collections compared to estimates. And so far through July, it looks okay. It looks as though we're actually hitting our estimates on our monthly revenue projections. So that's a good sign, but the jury's still out for Q3 and Q4 this year. And as a result of that, as I mentioned earlier, the legislative budget instructions have requested each agency of the state, including the universities, to prepare a 5% budget reduction plan for next year. Again, A, at least it's just 5%, I guess, and B, it's just a plan. It's certainly a sign, though, that the legislature is still being cautious and somewhat uncertain about what's going to happen over the next few quarters, and Tim will shed a little bit more light about that as we move through. We also know that there's going to be a continued effort, notwithstanding whatever happens, to tighten our belts, to look for efficiencies, to continue best practices, to find shared services across the system, and to encourage cost-saving initiatives when and where we can. So included in your committee materials today, you're going to find a lot of information from various initiatives that our universities have engaged in, they've been engaged in for years, and frankly, I commend them. I think they've been very successful in the process. It's an ongoing battle, but I think they're moving the mark fairly well. One of the additional roles that we have as a committee, as well as the whole board, will be to be advocates in this legislative session for the university system. The system as a whole, our aspirational goals for the system, and what we're going to look at in this budget that Tim is going to present us to is clearly an advocacy and aspirational budget. It includes cornerstone funding that'll be tied directly to university performance as well. Tim will talk about that a bit. So Tim, without further ado, why don't you walk us through our 2013-2014 LBR.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I do want to give a brief overview of what the revenue picture looks like. What we're funded from primarily, in addition to tuition, is general revenue and lottery. Of course, lottery is allocated to education. General revenue, unlike PICO, which is allocated by the commissioner for each education sector, you have everybody competing for general revenue. All the other state agencies, the college system, K-12, natural resources, and everyone. So it's not like divided up by entity. So we're having to make our case, just like everyone else is, and convince the legislature that we need these resources. And you can see the growth in GR and lottery over the next 3 years based on this summer's estimating conference. For 13-14, which is what our LBR will be based on, it's a little higher than 14-15. That's primarily because we'll have a lot of one-time or non-recurring funds available in that year, and then they would drop out in subsequent years. The state does a 3-year financial outlook each September. I believe this was presented to the Legislative Budget Commission yesterday. I'm not sure what action they took on that, but it's always interesting to look at that report to see what the experts in the legislature are looking at in terms of resources and what's going on with general revenue. So their estimates for 13-14, just for GR, is $27.5 billion. The base budget, and that's if they don't make any actions and just do a rollover of current recurring funds, you have $24.6 billion. And then there are certain transfers to Lawton Childs and Budget Stabilization Fund. And then they identify critical needs, which we'll talk about in just a minute. Then there's also $1 billion for reserves. The total expenditures of $27.4 billion is what they're estimating for 13-14. And you see there's actually a little bit of balance left over to carry into the next fiscal year. This is the first time in a number of years that they've actually had a balance. In prior years, you would see a negative number there of $2 billion, or $3 billion, or $4 billion. So you're going into session knowing that you had to make drastic cuts. So this is not the case this year, but there obviously are a lot of things pending. We don't know what's going to happen with Medicaid, the new national health care program. We're not out of hurricane season yet, so you don't know what happens there, but at least initially, things are looking much better.
Tim, can I throw one, Mr. Chairman, on the table? It's really an important one, and that is we don't know what's going to happen regarding the lawsuit on the 3% change in employee contribution to the state pension system. That has, depending on which way it goes, that has, could have potentially an impact. I saw Governor Beard hold up his fingers of as much as $2 billion. It's gigantic, and that one is still sitting out there as well.
That's correct. What is included in critical needs? These are things such as Medicaid, K-12 enrollment, and employer share of health benefits. Those are the things they've identified as the primary drivers that they're going to have to fund next year. Then they have what we call other high priority needs. These would be things like economic development or workforce programs. It will include employer shares of retirement increases, and then the rest is spread over K-12, health and human services, criminal justice, and so forth. Here's what they're looking at for the university system. So out of those critical and high priority areas, they've identified growth of 2%. They're looking at the continued phase-in of the 2 new medical schools, P.O.M. for facilities, which we generally receive funding every year, IT performance funding, the second year of that program, which would be $15 million, and they are not recommending any tuition increase in their 3-year financials, whereas last year they had recommended a 7.5% increase, although they ended up doing 0. That was a recommendation last year, or at least included in the financial outlook. So looking at their 3-year financial outlook, you can see what the appropriation would be to the university system. So the black bar are state appropriations, the light blue bar is tuition. So there is a expected growth in the university system budget. And I will point out for 13-14, you'll see the state support go from $1.7 billion to almost $2.1 billion. So they have included $300 million back into the budget. Then on top of that, an additional $60 million to cover some of the other things I just mentioned. So now getting into our LBR. This is a summary that's in your packet for the E&G core budget. This is our primary mission of instruction. We're looking at a 5.3% increase, $172 million. That would be in addition to the $300 million that would be rolled back into the budget as part of the startup process. And then you can see each of the special units, what the increase would be for a total E&G and special unit increase of a little less than 5%. And then we have other special initiatives that are included in the university system budget, Institute of Human and Machine Cognition, the Moffitt Cancer Center, and so forth. And we'll go over some of the initiatives that they're looking on doing here in just a moment. So if the legislature would approve the budget as it's being presented, that's what the 1314 bar would look like. So you see the cost shifts from the student at about 50-50 to about 58-42%, because this budget request, as in prior years, is built based on no tuition increases. We do have some preliminary fall headcount information in. Once again, the system is up. These are still very preliminary estimates, but we're looking at about 335,000 students, about 5,000 or 6,000 more than the prior year. Recent data in on the baccalaureate degrees. We'll continue to have a higher proportion of degrees in STEM than in non-STEM. Same is true for graduate degrees. So one of our key performance issues in the LPR, we have the second year of the IT Performance Initiative. This is the $15 million that you heard about back at the June meeting. That we're currently getting data in so those funds can be awarded. So this will be the second year of that pilot program. And then we have performance funding, which is our big issue this year of $118 million. And I know the chancellor's very excited about this. I don't know if he wanted to say a few words on this one or...
Well, yeah, let me provide some context. What you just heard in the presentation is the fact that if all things being equal, the legislature did what they proposed to do in this upcoming year, restore the $300 million and fund the additional light items that Tim covered before, such as making good on the commitments to the 2 new medical schools, the PO&M money, et cetera. On top of that, we would be requesting a little bit over $100 million for purposes of distributing dollars to the universities and tying those that distribution to the work plan process to bring clarity to exactly where those dollars would go and what they would be used for, and then subsequently how they could be tracked relative to moving the needle on those areas identified by the universities and their boards and the Board of Governors over last year and this year in terms of what the highest priorities of the institutions are. So why is that different? Well, instead of just requesting an additional amount of money as we have in the past, it is the fact that the new money that we would be requesting on top of that which is already budgeted within the legislative proposal, this $100 million, would be tied to transparency and clarity and a metric-based approach of accounting that you all have created here over the last few years. We call it the work plan and the strategic planning process, to make sure that it's obvious where those dollars are going, how they're being spent, and what impact at the end of the day they're having on each individual university. Again, it also gives us the ability to continue to bring forward the differentiated mission of each of the institutions beyond just those things that are common to all of our institutions at the same time. So it's a very different approach to requesting an additional amount of money. This, of course, I think ties directly into what Governor Whatley and the students have been professing, which is aiming higher. And this, if you will, would be the Board of Governors' approach to putting a face on the issue of how we would propose to aim higher, not just for more, but how those dollars would be infused into the system just as importantly.
Thank you, Chancellor. Tim?
And our plan is next week, we will send out instruction to the universities asking them to tie these dollars back to the work plan metrics that they presented in June and how those metrics may increase based on this infusion of dollars. And then we would bring those back to the committee at the November meeting so y'all can see what the universities plan on doing with those resources. Some of the other issues that we have in the budget are our standard plan operations and maintenance. We have about 22 facilities coming online with about 650,000 square feet, so we need funds to maintain and operate those. Once again, the continued implementation of the medical schools. This is the 7th year of the 10-year plan for funding those two programs. IFAS workload issue. This is a formulaic-driven calculation that the board approved back in 2004. It's based on work that's done throughout the state, include constituent contacts, meetings, phone calls, and so forth. Very, it's also kind of performance-driven based on what IFAS does. Then when you had the Florida Virtual Campus, you'll remember that 3 entities were merged into one: the Florida Distance Learning Consortium, the Florida Center for Library Automation, Community College Library Automation is now one entity. Half their budget is split in the university budget. The other half is in the college system budget. They're asking for an increase of $4 million total. Our half of that is $2 million. This is primarily to support $2.5 million for the degree completion initiative. That program was vetoed last year, and also for some workload issues. The Institute of Human and Machine Cognition, I think this board received a presentation from them a year ago, but they do some great things related to our veterans. Are looking for additional funding to continue that research. The Moffitt Cancer Center, $3.3 million for additional faculty for cancer research and their cancer care database. You saw the slide. We're having increased enrollments this year. That translates to about 8,200 additional FTE. That is revenue that is collected by the system. To spend that tuition revenue, we have to have authority from the legislature. So we're asking for $48 million in additional authority to allow us to spend the tuition that we're collecting for the increased enrollments this year. And finally, there's our major gift matching endowment program. I'm sorry Governor Stavros wasn't here, because I know he would want to say a few words about how important this program is. It was suspended a year ago, but there's still $285 million that has not been matched. There's $100 million on the Cortellis facility side as well. So this is, don't know if this will be funded, but at least we're keeping the issue in front of the legislature. So that's it for the university system. For the board office, we have a flat budget, $6 million. We had $300,000 for the online university study. That drops out of our budget since those were non-recurring funds. So $6 million to support our 52 authorized position. So that concludes the LBR presentation, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Tim. Are there any additional questions for Tim? I know we've all been pretty thoroughly briefed on these. Seeing none, then I will look for a motion to approve the 2013-2014 LBR request for the state university system and allow the chancellor to make changes as necessary. There's a motion and a second. Is there any additional discussion or questions? President Manchin.
Thank you, Governor. The 2012 legislature reduced the state's contribution to employees' optional retirement plans by 2.2%. That calculation hit each university according to the salaries of the faculty that were involved. It was supposed to be computed on the basis of state salaries, because that's the amount that the legislature was reducing. In the case of the University of Florida, they figured it on total salaries, including grants and clinic revenues. Since you can't pay back money from that source, we had to cut our general budget an additional $8.3 million to offset that erroneous cut. Staff admitted it was a mistake. They said, though, that the number they needed for their budget cut had already been calculated and they wouldn't reverse it. I would ask that the Board of Governors add that to the $300 million that has to be restored, but it's clearly an erroneous assumption that was used to take that money out, and it's hit primarily our medical school, which is already one of our least funded entities.
Let me ask other presidents, was this problem unique to the University of Florida?
Do you know, Mr. President, do you know the answer to that?
We're the only one with a clinical practice plan that's up and running that is tagged to their base salary. Others pay their clinicians offline, I don't call it offline, but in a separate model so that the retirement system is not calculated.
What I'd like to do is ask Tim to work with Joe or whoever on your team, Mr. President, to look at that, and the motion provides the chancellor with some flexibility to modify the budget request, and if that makes good sense, Mr. President, I have no aversion to that if a mistake was made and admitted. Does anyone else have any hard feelings against that? Great, so Mr. President, if you'll accept that that's within, and the board will accept that's within the chancellor's discretion in this motion, I'll ask Tim to work with Joe on your team and see if we can't get that issue resolved. Thanks for bringing that up.
Thank you very much.
Any other question or discussions with regard? President
I
Kenchak?
was just notified by our CFO that we had that mistake as well.
Great. Tim, will you work with the presidents of the universities and see if that mistake has impacted some of the other universities, and if so, we'll incorporate that into the chancellor's discretion. Any other
I would do
questions?
that. It has impacted some of the other institutions as well. I mean, the problem is that the legislature used the Division of Retirement's database instead of our own database, so they picked up non-E&G employees, and that's been the problem.
Well, hopefully we can put our arms around what that number looks like and make that additional request if a mistake has been admitted.
And
there.
Mr. Chairman, we will, of course, keep the Board of Governors in the loop as to what those numbers are. I appreciate the delegated authority, but I want to make sure you all know what those numbers represent.
Well, we should have our arms around that by our next meeting, and we can ratify whatever changes that you deem to make. But if there's preliminary filings required, I think you've got authority to make those filings, Chancellor.
Chancellor Brogan, on the lawsuit, is that only for the first year in the judge's ruling, or does this now accumulate?
Well, of course, it's an accumulate. It depends on how the judge would be ruling. But if, in effect, the ruling goes against the state, you're looking at a prospective amount of money, because naturally, each year that is in place, the money accrues. So there's the immediate first-year amount of money, and all this depends on when the judge would rule and how, but there is clearly the amount of money that's already been adjusted on that percentage. And then the longer the process goes, the greater the amount would accrue. So there's just a lot of unanswered questions based on when a judge might rule and what that ruling exactly might be as to the impact it would have.
Great. Thank you. Is there any additional discussion on the motion with regard to the 2013-2014 LBR? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All in favor of approval of the 2013-2014 legislative budget request, providing the chancellor with some flexibility to make changes as we've discussed, and any other that deems necessary, please say aye. Aye. And opposed. Motion carries. I'm now looking for a motion for the 2013-2014 LBR for the board office that we've just seen in the presentation. Again, providing the chancellor with some authority on some technical changes. There's a motion. Second. And a second. Any discussion? Seeing none, all in favor of the motion, please say aye. Aye. And opposed. That motion carries. Tim, anything else to add for the good?
No, sir, I do not have anything else.
Great. Does anyone on the committee have anything to add? We're coming in about a half an hour early, which is shocking for us as a team, but I am thrilled about it. If there's nothing else from the committee, we stand adjourned.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. What I think we'll do is take a 10-minute break and then start our Board of Governors meeting a little bit early. And Mr. President, maybe you and I can talk about how to handle lunch, because I don't want to goof up your people. Thank you. 10 minutes.
Oh, it says upon adjournment.